So I guess how this came about is that you guys at Hartlepool Creatives asked us at Tees Valley Screen to reflect on the reality of filmmaking post-COVID. And this, I would say, was in like the crisis phase of lockdown. And I just remember like the immediate outlook at that time was just, I think it's like really incredibly gloomy for everyone. And sort of had no idea of what industry we might have to come back to. So okay, so what should we do? But I was kind of thinking about it and thinking about what seemed important at that point and what might also be a bit of a beacon of hope for anyone who was reading. And the thing that I'm most passionate about, and this was before COVID and during the lockdown and now, is documentary, independent documentary, for lots of reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into, but also thinking about Teesside and thinking about the Northeast and the people and our storytelling traditions and the landscape and our artists and our filmmakers. We have all of these sort of rich resources, but we're quite underrepresented in terms of documentary filmmaking. And so I wanted to talk about that and talk about voice in documentary and talk about opportunities that we have here. And so having like established that, it seemed quite obvious to me that the person that I wanted to hear from in this was Jeanie Finlay, who I hope she won't mind me saying is one of Teesside's finest exports. She's on, I think we've got her on loan to Nottingham at the minute, but you know, in who she is, like in her warmth and in her honesty and in her kind of creativity as a filmmaker, it just feels, you know, Teesside through and through. And so I asked Jeanie to write this think piece for us on her kind of hopes for documentary in this new normal. And I think, again, you know, in this moment of crisis, it was probably quite a big ask of Jeanie. I remember, like, at that time, and I don't know, maybe now, but hope is one of those things that kind of was in shortest supply. And so I guess I wanted to acknowledge that and say thank you again to Jeanie for this incredible article that she wrote for us at what was a really difficult time. And if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, please do. It's got some really honest and personal reflections on what's important to Jeanie in her work and about making work in the current climate. But then it also has some fantastic considerations and recommendations for making documentary, which I know we're going to get into. I think within that as well, we're also going to look at some of the structural issues in documentary filmmaking that maybe existed before COVID, and why it's important that we challenge those, so we get a truly wide and diverse range of stories and of viewpoints represented. And so with all that said, I'm going to introduce the panelists. I should also say as well, for anybody joining who doesn't know about Tees Valley Screen, we're an organisation that exists to boost and support the screen industries in Teesside and make, you know, great work happen and support people to make that work. And we do that with the Tees Valley Combined Authorities and the European Regional Development Fund, which is lovely. So introducing the panelists, and will you guys, I think, unmute and put your videos on as well, but joined of course by Jeanie Finlay, who is the director of BIFA nominated Seahorse and Emmy nominated Game of Thrones The Last Watch, but also Sound It Out, which was about the last remaining record store in Teesside. We've also got Lynn Nwokari, who is an editorial and programming consultant for film and particularly for documentary. And she consults for Sundance and for Doc Society and the London Film Festival, among others. And also Alison Agar, who is a visual artist, photographer and filmmaker from Teesside. And Alison recently made a piece of work with us at Tees Valley Screen called The Living Archive, in which an AI curated an exhibition that pulled out elements of film and audio documenting our local area in an exhibition space, which was a really fantastic piece of work. So really pleased to be joined by these three lovely panelists today. But what I'd also say as well is that it is an open discussion. It's a bit of like a state of the nation chat about documentary, and so we'd really like to hear from you all in the audience as well. reflecting on your work or the things that you're interested in. So please do use the Q&A function on your screens. If you do have any questions, or not just questions actually, like anything that you want to contribute, anything that's in your mind or anything that you want to reflect on. And there is a chat function as well, and that I always think is a good space, you know, if you want to introduce yourselves as you've been doing, or talk about your work, or reflect kind of on the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, without, you know, putting yourself out there in the Q&A. So feel free to do that. But yes, I thought what it might be a good way to start, Jeanie, is if you wanted to reflect a bit on the experience of writing that piece.
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for that amazing introduction. I sort of don't feel worthy now. Yeah, the piece, if you've read it, it's interesting because I talked to Jen about writing the piece, and one of the things that I've been doing, that I started doing at the beginning of lockdown, was to do, I offered up my time for free to filmmakers all over the world, and I started all these mentoring sessions with people, and it made me really think about what the future of documentary could be. And I actually stopped doing the sessions after a little while, partly because they were totally exhausting, but also because I wasn't sure how to, I felt a bit of a fraud advising people at a time that is so unpredictable. Who am I to say, why don't you try this, or why don't you try this for your film, because the future's so uncertain. And so I stopped doing my mentoring, and just, you know, did a whole variety of different stuff, from researching new projects to painting the worst rainbow in the world on the front of my door, and growing a garden full of vegetables, and, you know, deeply personal things for my family, like saying, before lockdown I'd never used Zoom, and by the end, you know, a few weeks in, I joined a choir. I'd started editing with my editor in London, and I'd also been on a Zoom call with my auntie in a COVID ward and said goodbye to her 2 days before she died. So this is sort of really like fast changing, extraordinary times. That's what it felt like to me. So it's given this great opportunity by Jen to write something, and I've got to be honest, I really, really struggled. I wasn't quite sure what I could say. So then I just sort of thought, I wonder if I can just offer some provocations and try and distill the things that I look for in my work that I think can be useful for other filmmakers. So looking for, you know, valuing small stories, thinking about localness. It was interesting, when I was doing the mentoring, I was interviewing someone who, a young filmmaker who proposed 3 stories. One of them meant that they'd have to travel across the world. One of them was they'd have to travel across Europe. And then they pitched this last story, which was 2 miles from their house. And they thought that there was less value in a story that was local to them. And I think that there's a real value in understanding an area and bringing a local voice to a story. It's what I try to do with Sound It Out, and it's what I try and do with every single film I made. And I think in the wake of this pandemic, where travel is more difficult, I think it's a really valuable approach to take to filmmaking. So yes, that's one of the things I was thinking. But yeah, it was really, really difficult to write, but once I'd finished, I felt like, oh yeah, hopefully other people might find that useful and interesting. You know, writing, it's the thing that it's good when it's done, when it's finished.
Like I definitely keep referring back to it, and just you know, some of the things you talk about is like, you know, things we should be doing, not just sort of post-COVID, but that kind of almost like a manifesto for, okay, if you're going to do this, these are the things to consider. So yeah, a great primer, but something that felt like it felt honest and it felt genuine. So yeah, very grateful for that. And I remember as well, you know, when we were talking on the phone about it, we sort of talked about the reasons, maybe why, not why we got into film, but the reasons to carry on making film, or what felt important. And I wondered if sort of Alison and Lynn and Jeanie as well, maybe if we start with you, Alison, on just giving a bit of background on maybe a little bit about like how you got into film, but anything sort of in the recent months that have made you think, no, yes, even with all of this crisis, you know, I do still want to keep doing this, and this is why.
Yeah. So my background really is kind of fine art, and that's how I moved into film. And photography as well. So it's always kind of been there, but at times I've kind of focused on it more. And at the moment, I'm focusing on making films and photographing. Last year was a massive turning point for me with the work that I did with Nick Williams, the Living Archive, that was funded an artist residency with Tees Valley Screen and the Auxiliary. And that kind of made me think about new approaches and new ways of kind of presentation and new ways of working a bit. So I think lockdown for me has been kind of figuring out things like that and testing things. It was quite difficult as well because I was due to start shooting in March as well. So that kind of didn't happen really. So I haven't sort of shot the footage, but I've had a chance to kind of reflect and sort of test out pieces as well. So that's been interesting.
Cool. And what about you, Lynn? I've never heard your origin story for film.
It's a long and winding one. I started off actually as production assistant and moved on to script supervising for film, feature films, fiction in UK and US. When I came back to the UK to work in production, I was a little bit disillusioned with how the industry was working in terms of fiction, and I contemplated leaving film altogether. And I just one time applied for an internship at the BFI, the British Film Institute, and got one. And it kind of opened up a new world of film beyond production. And from there, I ended up working in festival capacities, but also in development, which moved me on to cinema distribution. So working with independent cinemas around the UK and programming content, the content that are plentiful in London, making sure it was accessible to everybody else. And then I ended up kind of deciding to focus on documentary. And what I do now is fairly unique because I work across the whole of the life cycle of a film, from development through to distribution. And yeah, so that's a really general rundown of my history in a documentary and film in general. And I found that it's from the decision maker's perspective, or quote unquote gatekeeper perspective, I've seen an influx, especially from documentary. It's like documentarians are used to having to be flexible with what's happening in the world. That's the nature of making documentary film. And I feel like the same has happened with COVID. So if anything, I've been more busier than I've ever been in my entire life, with all the stories that are coming through, which is really hopeful and enlightening for me. I've seen more diversity in terms of what's coming through, and I mean that in regional as well as other forms of diversity, which is and people claiming their stories and wanting to tell it themselves, as opposed to outsiders coming in and telling their stories for them. So that's basically what I've seen. I've seen a lot more introspective cinema, rather than the need to, as Jeanie was talking about, rather than there's been a lot, especially with UK filmmakers, of wanting to travel the world and tell stories about the rest of the world. And I feel like lockdown has forced, which I was always been encouraging over the last few years, to encourage people to tell stories about what's happening around them in the communities that they live. And I feel like lockdown has kind of forced that. So there's a lot of rich content that is homegrown coming out at the moment. That's what I'm seeing.
Yes, that's what we like to see.
That's really encouraging. I think there's so much stuff I see on TV which looks like, I don't know, like an idea of what a regional film might be, and you sort of think, wow, if someone who actually lived and understood that world made that film, it would be really, really different. I'm always wanting to see stuff where people know they know somewhere in their bones, or they can find, you know, it's not saying that you have to live somewhere to tell that story, but I think, you know, thinking about the Northeast, I always think of the Northeast as like someone in your family that you can criticize, but no one else can. It's like criticizing your sister or your cousin or something. And I felt, so when I made Sound It Out, you know, it was based in the last surviving record shop in Teesside, and the film started off as my love-hate letter to the place where I'd grown up, and ended up being this real love letter, warts and all. And I felt ready to tell that story, because when I've seen stories about the Northeast before, they've been commissioned by people in London who think that the Northeast is this like long distant place and make some great assumptions about it. Anyway, it drives me crazy.
Yeah. I mean, like, sorry to interrupt.
No, go on.
So I'm based in London, and one of the things that I have done is aligned myself with organisations that are not doing what you're describing, Jeanie, because even though I'm from London, I know what it's like to feel like your narrative is being taken away from you and being told and co-opted by outsiders, so to speak. And so for me, from working as a cinema distributor and seeing and learning about the different like film landscapes and industries in the UK, it was really important that you give the autonomy to the community. And so I used to say to people, I have no problems with people who are not from communities going in and finding really excellent stories, but it's all about the collaborative nature of film. You have to involve the people whose stories you're telling as much as possible, because then that's the way that you can get the nuance and the richness of the story, and not have, and for it to be a complete contrast to what you have described as like people who don't consult with the community and tell these stories that lack any kind of nuance and are filled with bias and things like that. So that's been really important to me, and I feel like COVID just kind of forced it into acceleration for this to become a real thing that is taking off, and I think is probably hopefully here to stay.
But there are some, thank you, Lynn. I think that there are some really good things that have come from COVID, that being one of them. And also like the fact that we can just do this, like Zooms from our living room. Like, you know, when you've certainly for me and Jeanie, I don't know how it's been for you in Nottingham, but feeling like to an extent the industry is in London, but you're like, oh, can you just pop down? You just pop down for a meeting, and you're like, I could just pop down for a meeting, but actually it's 120 quid return on the train. And but then you feel, I always get like a FOMO if I say no. So I think it's kind of, Zoom is democratizing it more so than it was before. The intention was there before, but now it really feels like it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely opened things up. I mean, a week before lockdown, I was supposed to be on a panel in Scotland, and I put my back out, and I said, I can't fly, please, I can't get on a plane, can you Skype me into the cinema? And at that point they just said, we can't do that, we haven't got the technology to do that. And can you imagine that being the response now from a festival? We can't Skype you in. You know, Zoom's so great. Yeah, I think it's good. I mean, I seem to, you know, 6 months ago I was spending my life on a train to London, getting a text off someone saying that the meeting had been cancelled on my way down there. So I'm enjoying doing much more, meeting people like this, you know, and even editing. I edited for 7 weeks. My editor lives in London, and we just screen shared. So we clocked on at 9:30 in the morning and we clocked off at 7:30 every night, and just edit it. And it was just the same. It was amazing. It actually saved us money because I didn't have to pay for her travel and accommodation. So it meant that the money I'd lost from my shoot that was cancelled in America, I could commission a composer, because I'm always like, how can I put it on screen? How can I redirect money? So that felt really, oh wow, yeah, it's a positive thing. That is a good thing.
It's a great thing. I did want to ask though, like one of my main talking points is kind of, I mean, we kind of covered how work has changed since COVID happened, but do you think, in terms of documentaries specifically, do you think we have responsibilities to give an outlook on the world at a moment of crisis? And somebody's actually asked in the audience as well, is there any way we can ignore COVID in a doc from this point on, or does it almost have to feature because those are the conditions? Don't know if anyone feels...
Well, I mean, I'm making a film at the moment in America, you know, my talk of local thing, I was filming in America. And so what I've ended up doing is I left a camera out there because I was so confident I was going to be in Oregon in March. So what I've done is I've taught the woman that I'm making the film about to film. So she has been filming. And what we've done is we've gathered some... I think COVID is a big thing, and it's important. It's impacting on our lives just by the way it looks, you know, whether it's a mask or you're in a more local area, or the amount of, you know, social distancing, or if you lose people in your family, you know. So we've reflected some of that, but I'm interested to see how it will work in the long run. When they announced lockdown, one of the things I did was I went to my office and I got all my camera equipment and brought it home, because I was convinced that I would be outside filming like a journalist, you know, gathering stuff for the pandemic. But then I read the guidelines that were put out by the IDA, the International Documentary Association, and Doc Society and Field Division. And this isn't like other things. Like if I go out and film, I've got to think about putting myself in danger, putting the people that I'm filming in danger. There have to be very strict protocols and guidelines around that. So it's not as simple as, oh, here's a pandemic, let's document this. At the beginning of lockdown, there was a fear that if I was to do that, you know, I was worried about, I'd heard a story about care workers who were being asked to get people to sign DNRs, do not resuscitate orders. And just like, oh my God, this is a amazing story that needs to be exposed. It's now been exposed in the press. But if I'd done that, I would have put the people that I was filming and my family in danger. And I think that's something you have to think about really, really carefully. You know, is it worth it? I also think as a narrative sense, I do worry that I've noticed in this last week, there's been 4 or 5 big COVID docs have been announced. You know, Alex Gibney's making one. Ai Weiwei has made one. There's, oh God, what's he called? Oh my God, I've completely blanked on his name. There's a British guy working in Canada has made a documentary. There's been one on the BBC, you know, and like, what's your unique take on this? I'm not sure that actually, I'm looking for the smaller, personal, intimate stories. And I sort of feel like you don't always have to you don't have to hit the nail on the head to make something that's moving about this time. You know, in the Spanish flu, epidemic of 1918, it's really striking that in a lot of the literature and media and art that was made at the time, there's no mention of the pandemic. It's more of a sort of overriding atmosphere. And I do think that in this time, I wonder whether once it's over, once we're on the other side of this, I'm not sure people will want to revisit it. It'll be like hearing a Christmas song on January the 14th. You know, you're done. And it's going to be, I think that we'll be hungry for stories of the pandemic in 30 years when it's history. We're too much in history at the moment to be able to reflect on it, is my sort of feeling.
Absolutely, with any kind of like distance, or to really understand what the impact has been. An experience that I had, ended up like thinking sort of about, you know, even what documentary was. So I've been making a film about a family in Naples for the last 4 years. And somebody who's involved in the financing of the film when COVID happened said, oh, well, you've got to feature COVID because it's documentary. So, you know, it's actuality, it's observation, this is what's happening. And I was thinking, is it though? Because that's not what my film's about. Like, yes, COVID has impacted on them, but I'm telling a completely different story that, you know, that the story that we're telling is about kind of inevitability and possibility, particularly for a young boy growing up in a particular part of Naples. And that is gonna impact him whether COVID exists or not. There are so many factors that influence that. And so I thought, well, yeah, okay, a documentary is actuality, but it's not just about observation. There's the story that, you know, I'm telling, or the story that we as a filmmaking team are telling. And we don't have to mention COVID just because it exists and because it is happening. And actually, we're going to throw in a card at the end that kind of explains what they're up to during COVID, but that isn't the story. That isn't the story that we want to put on screen. And then that kind of gets us into the point of thinking about, you know, the perspective of the filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker. These are real people with real lives, but it's you as the filmmaker, however hard you try to be, you know, of that community, it's still your version of their story. And like over the last few years of my work, just kind of getting into the kind of the ethics of that and the responsibilities that, you know, we as filmmakers have to the subject of our docs. So yeah, I think it's a roundabout way of saying, you know, that's not what your film's about. You don't have to talk about it. So we've talked a bit about COVID and sort of how work's changing, but I think, you know, kind of intending this to be a bit of an overview of like a state, as I said, state of the nation chat on docs. Just before COVID happened, there was not an article, but a study released about the kind of need for structural change in documentary. I think it was called Keeping It Real, documentary film policy for the UK. And then we also have, you know, the idea that you mentioned and the Documentary Producers Alliance kind of working on how to make documentary more fair and more diverse and more equitable and more sustainable, and like kind of how it's supported by gatekeepers. And Lynn, by the way, you said you're a gatekeeper. I've never considered you sort of a gatekeeper. You've never, whenever I've had conversations.
I thought myself as that, but
no, good.
At least in the last few months, people have introduced me as that, and I don't like it personally. I don't know, because but it's a way for people to kind of, it's like a quick way of which people to kind of understand the where I work, where I fit in terms of filmmaking. I'd say more that I basically work with funders and tastemakers, but I'm not one myself.
Because decision maker is the other word that's used. But I think gatekeeper suggests, some kind of barrier, and in I think the documentary community, it is more open. Like I've always had, constructive and warm conversations with doc. I'm going to do it. Doc gatekeepers that when you think, you know, I'm speaking to people who understand film and love docs and love stories. Yeah, but back to the original point, yeah, just kind of looking, you know, Jeanie, when we started writing this think piece, it was, you know, looking at the new normal, but did we need to change anyway? You know, was the old normal kind of any good? And kind of some of the things that were happening. Alison, I'm going to point to you really, because we touched on earlier about kind of COVID opening up opportunities for regional filmmakers, and we are in Teesside. This is Tees Valley Screen, and I wondered if you wanted to chat a bit about some of the stuff that you've seen happening in Teesside. That's kind of cool. And
definitely. So for me, over the last over lockdown, I've kind of had chance to sort of connect like over Zoom with lots of different people, and one of the highlights for me was I finally got to see an amazing documentary set in Tees Valley over at Greetham Creek, Warren Harrison's The Creek. Absolutely loved it. Such a beautiful sort of poetic film, and it was just absolutely really captured the area that he was sort of kind of experiencing, which is kind of like Greetham Creek and North Gare. Also as well, there's kind of been lots of photographers, filmmakers, artists who are looking at sort of the Tees Valley landscape and histories as well. Jamie MacDonald's work, where he's kind of photographing and filming the sort of changes in the industrial landscape as well. Holly Galloway has produced some really like lovely kind of cinematic pieces of work that are being developed as well.
She's here in the audience, by the way.
Oh, really beautiful work. Marcus Diamond as well, some experimental kind of short films, collages, animations, that is kind of based around like Cotham and Warrenby, South Gare, Redcar, which is kind of like a bit of an underrepresented area as well. Jonathan Chapman, who is exhibiting some photography at Platform A Gallery, kind of very rooted in sort of like walking and photographing as well, and Wax as well, with Wax's photography collective, with Anthony Chambers, Amy Owens, Rachel Deakin and Jason Hines, and they've been doing some really interesting kind of photography projects, kind of collaborating with a lot of different people as well, which is really exciting and interesting. And Jason's just been selected as one of the photographers for Portrait of Britain. One of his photographs is kind of has been selected, but I mean that's just a sort of small section really. I feel like I could go on, but what's sort of really interesting is it's kind of coming from it's people's experiences of Tees Valley as well. So we've been able to kind of chat over Zoom and kind of talk about our interests and where we kind of cross over, recommending different things as well. I must also say as well, some of the help that I've had, in particular from like historians, town planners, architects as well, has been super helpful to me. So I think I would just like to mention the work that Tosh Warwick's doing as well, regeneration in Middlesbrough, and Daniel Cochrane, North East statues as well. And there's lots of kind of like emerging voices coming through as well. Elizabeth Evans, who is kind of filming like a young filmmaker who's filming around sort of the kind of Teesside industrial landscape as well, and it's changing so quickly as well that for me there's like a need to document it and a need to sort of photograph and be around and be around it as well. And I think lockdown for me, I mean, my films are rooted within landscape, and I kind of shoot lots and lots of different kind of things. It's rooted in kind of walking and experience as well. So lockdown for me has been like towards sort of when it kind of started to be eased, I began to go out more on my own with the camera and kind of visit places that I hadn't visited in Teesside before, and I've kind of lived here and have been brought up here, so that was kind of really, really good. But there's really a fabulous kind of network of people as well, and I suppose with the change, with the transition from the kind of industrial to digital city as well, that's kind of like I feel like I want to photograph as much as I can as kind of like documentation.
And I think one thing that you kind of touch on is like, there are what I saw coming back to Teesside a couple of years ago, like I moved out for work and then back, is just that in Teesside there's always like these really interesting sparks of things happening, but it's really like DIY, and so you get these really interesting ideas, and yes, lots of it is kind of place based, and it feels like kind of inspired by this landscape that we have around us, because it is so kind of weird, and it goes from very sort of natural landscape, but then these kind of hulking grey like industrial skeletons that you can't help but reflect on, but people are reflecting on them. And I guess what I think about, because I have a gatekeeper role at Tees Valley Screen, and I worry about documentary film in Teesside, and I think like this is all incredible, but how can we be supporting people to get voices heard from Teesside? Because going back to this idea of like the way that the industry is structured, and who the gatekeepers are at like Channel 4 or BBC or British Film Institute, there's a way of working in Teesside and in the Northeast which isn't necessarily I guess familiar to people who might be in those gatekeeping roles in London or Leeds now, as it's seen as that's where Channel 4 is. So how do we bridge that gap? And I wonder, Lynn, not to put you on the spot, but like actually, you spoke about this earlier when you talked about working with local partnerships and stuff, but is there a way, like how can we bridge that gap? And also, how can we kind of challenge the representations of the Northeast that we see on screen in something like Benefit Street, when that's all that's getting commissioned, because that's what people think the Northeast is?
So kind of want to draw back to what I think Ian, when he was talking about mentioning COVID in the films, and what I wanted to say was COVID has inextricably changed the way in which people are making their films, but also about the way in which they're observing life and society and what's happening. There's a lot of more introspection about how they observe, like as Alison was talking about the space that you're in, making much of your space, but also about what's happening in society. So one of the things is obviously like a lot of the social movements that are happening right now. And I think that it's before COVID, to be quite honest, filmmakers were rightfully becoming disillusioned and also losing their patience with institutions in the way in which they were treating kind of diverse voices as a tick boxing exercise, rather than actually doing the work that was needed. And a lot of it was, from my opinion, was the struggle was that there was a big disconnect in lots of these institutions and these broadcasters. They don't reflect the audience they're supposed to be serving, often more than not. So they don't interact with the audiences on a meaningful level to understand what it is that people want to see, and also what filmmakers want to be making. I feel that this was happening just before lockdown. There was a lot of discussions, there was a lot of things that I was hearing. So when I used to work with Doc Society, we used to do road shows, and we would travel around the whole of the UK. And these were the things that people were, filmmakers was talking about their frustrations about. And because Doc Society is quite a small organization, we were doing what we could, but it was hard to kind of translate that to the bigger organizations and institutions that we were working with, to kind of get them to be a bit more flexible and a bit more active in what they should be doing. And then I think COVID hit, and as some of you drew upon about the equity kind of with the whole being, having the ability to speak directly to decision makers and people who are holding these senior roles and making all of these decisions about what kind of art is produced and what they choose to support, it kind of slightly leveled the playing field, so that all of these filmmakers who may have not had access to speak directly to these people were suddenly finding ways of doing so. And I feel like it's a long process because these institutions are often very bureaucratic and they are slow moving, but I feel like they are being forced to move faster because they can't rely on like box office, they can't rely on numbers, they can't rely on things like that anymore. So they have to find new ways of which to keep the industry going. And so it feels like it's an opportunity for filmmakers to basically talk about how you're not catering towards all of the communities. And they are coming to, when I was speaking earlier about being busier than ever, one of the things is I'm finding is a lot of institutions approaching people like me to ask me what I think could be done, like steps that could be taken to make it more equitable as it should be, to make it more easier that filmmakers, wherever they are regionally in the UK, if they want to embark on a filmmaking career, that they have the foundation and the support and the you know, the kind of collaborative industry market in which they can do that. And I think that it's still got obviously a massively long way to go and it's not perfect, but I feel like there are institutions that feel that they're under pressure. People are being a lot more vocal. They're, you know, the power of social media to actually hold organizations and institutions and even government policy to task is it's become much more powerful. And so I feel like it's turning into, I'm trying to see it as an opportunity for all of that possibility to happen. And I feel like organizations and institutions can no longer ignore or kind of, it's at the forefront because the virus has caused everyone to really look at things in a new light, in a new perspective.
I'm hopeful that it'll mean that there'll be more money for documentary, and in a totally pragmatic sense. The fact that docs, the budgets are usually much lower, surely this is an area of the industry that investment goes really far. I read something, don't quote me because I may be wrong, but I read something that said that for every pound that's invested by the BFI in documentary, it's the most sort of profitable investment that they make. Yet, you know, the amount of money committed to documentary in the UK is I think I read a stat that said there was more money spent on special effects in one animated feature than was spent by that was committed by the BFI to the whole of documentary. This was prior to the Doc Society thing, the Doc Society sort of taking that on. But yeah, I'm hopeful that our thriftiness and our nimbleness will make documentaries an easier, just a no-brainer.
Yeah,
that would be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, beyond that, documentaries are naturally actually becoming more popular. So with Netflix, with all these online platforms, documentary has become more popular. So people are no longer viewing documentary the old kind of staid 70s kind of academic style. They're actually seeing documentary as a proper art form. Filmmakers are approaching it as an art form, a more experimental, playful art form than sometimes fiction can be. So I think that on a an actual level of art, documentaries is slowly being viewed differently. Within context to like more money going into documentary, again, that's a long process. The Doc Society has been continuously in dialogue about getting more funding and having more money to invest in documentary. And there are incremental changes. It's like a kind of an ongoing discussion that we have to keep having, but it was quite enlightening. So I do programming, and I'm a program advisor for Documentaries for London Film Festival. And it was really interesting this year that because there's a reduced program, it was really interesting that a lot of the head programmers of different various genres and areas were for the first time recommending documentaries when they were fiction based, and they were the ones recommending documentaries. They found that documentaries were coming out much stronger than fiction. So even programmers who are rootly, their interest lies in fiction, were literally like, have you seen this documentary? It's phenomenal. So I feel like it's on the cusp. It's at the very beginning stages, but I think that with that kind of hunger for documentary filmmaking, especially when people are questioning like other forms of like news media and journalism, people are turning to documentary because to find what they feel that they're missing in journalism.
There's so many amazing documentaries out there. I'd always rather watch a doc than a fictional remake of it every day of the week.
But yeah, that's basically what's happening. I don't know if that's not fad is not the word, or whether or not it's something here to stay, but there is
waking up.
There is a different feeling towards how documentary is viewed, and maybe that will push
maybe I think it's probably
Netflix that area.
I think it's probably the Netflix effect in that they're more accessible than ever, you know, and also just the window that films are available for is much longer, you know, rather than you show a Storyville and it goes up on iPlayer for a month and then it disappears, and then you have to pay, you know, you have to rent it or buy it. So I think that might be a thing. We've got loads of questions.
Yeah, I was just thinking that will be good to open it out a bit. Nina White, how do you decide which stories to document? I think it's a massive question. I like it.
I would say, sorry, just quickly. So from a funder's perspective, we get asked this question. It's about, can you actually make that story into a film? That's like, from a funder's perspective, if you can actually articulate that story, because there's a difference between an idea and a story and an actual film. If you can show somebody you don't know that you've got a film, that is your film essentially. And if you have a story that you feel that will resonate with audiences. So I always tell filmmakers, especially if they're new, one of the most important things you should do right at the beginning of your filmmaking journey, even when you're in development stage, is to consider your audience. If you can visualize an audience, it doesn't have to be that specific, but if you feel like there's an audience for this, it helps you navigate how you're going to make the film, what creative approach you're going to have, what perspectives you're going to use, and how you're going to reach your audience, whether or not it's for streaming, whether or not it's for festivals, whether or not it's for broadcast. That's, I think, is fundamental. Is the 2 points is the story an actual film, and who is the audience?
I think thinking about the audience is really important. We got an award from the University of West England and Watershed and the Pervasive Media Studio. We got some money so we could study the audience of Orion, The Man Who Would Be King, for a year before the film was finished. So when the film was finished and we went out and we distributed it, we knew where the audience was because we had all their email addresses, and we had early adopters, and we did an artwork with masks that we took out into the environment. I heard someone say once, too many filmmakers think about giving birth, and they should really think about raising the baby. And that's what I think about a lot as a filmmaker. And that's why my DVDs are released as 7.7-inch gatefold DVDs with a vinyl soundtrack, because I want to make it a beautiful artwork that's, you know, it's like the film as well.
Sweet. Can I do a little add-on question to that? Because I think it ties in really nicely. Laura Jean, I believe it's Laura Jean from Tennessee, which is exciting. Laura Jean asks, Jeanie, you excel at finding smaller, intimate moments within your documentaries. How do you gain the trust of your subjects and get access to those moments? And do you think the pandemic will make it more difficult for you to get to those quiet stories?
That's a great question. I've got to say that Laura Jean is a woman that I met in Memphis when Orion closed the Memphis Film Festival, and I met a whole cohort of amazing Memphis women filmmakers, and we formed a mini rebellion at the festival because we were all women who made films. We got put on the panel about how to make great films as a lady rather than how to make awesome films. So we rebelled. We got quite drunk on the panel, drank a lot of whiskey out of mugs, and took the very lovely, but yeah, the festival director and just said, this is not okay. You need to not do this. We want to be on the awesome films panel. Anyway, I guess I think the thing that I'm looking for in a film is not necessarily the same thing that other people are looking for. My production company is called Glimmer because I'm looking for that tiny little something. And I really trust my gut instinct in terms of the stories I want to tell. When I was making Sound It Out, I had an idea of who I might like to see walk in the record shop. And when they arrived, I immediately knew that they were the right person. When I was walking around the set of Game of Thrones, there was a lot of big alpha characters, but actually the people I was interested in were maybe quieter, different people who'd never told their story before. And that they might not have even told their story to someone like in life. And so those people are really appealing and interesting to me because I think that I don't know, I just think I don't want to listen to show-offs. There's show-offs are why we've got the government we've got now, you know, like foolish show-offs. I want to give a platform to people who may not have told their story. And I remember when I was making Game of Thrones The Last Watch, because I had quite a big team, I kept being presented with these big, strong alpha characters. They kept saying, why don't you focus on this person? Why don't you focus on this? I was like, no. I want Del, who brings the snow. Everyone knows that even if you don't watch Game of Thrones, you know that winter is coming. And I want to meet the guy who brings the snow because that's amazing. And I want to hear his story. And I guess I just listen. That's the thing. I don't ever write questions, and my shoots are incredibly nimble to the point of giving you whiplash. You know, I have this very reflexive approach to filmmaking. So we'll film a bit, I'll edit a bit, I'll work out what I like, I'll go back and get more, I'll edit with Alice Powell, we'll create imagery, and then go back. So it's a constantly reflexive experience. When I was making Seahorse, I was constantly thinking about how the film could present, how I could visually represent the atmosphere of what does it mean to be a transgender man having a baby and being pregnant? What does dysphoria mean when you no longer have testosterone in your system? Now, I don't know what that feels like. I'm not a trans guy, I'm a cis woman, but I could really sort of try and tune into that feeling and create imagery. So I used to run 10K along the seafront and meditate on the film and allow the film to suggest itself. So it's really like being an artist. Anyway, I'm not answering your question properly, but I guess like I'm still working in lockdown and I'm developing new films. and I'm about to start a really big feature for Netflix. And the thing that I think that will make what I'm doing distinct and different is my point of view. I think it's really important to learn about the way that stories you're telling have been told in the past, and to really be self-aware about what it is that you can bring that's distinct in your approach. And I think it's really important to think about who you are passing the conch to, who is telling the story. You know, I'm telling the story because I'm in every frame of my films, even though I never, oh my God, I would never appear in a film, never in a million years. But the choices that I make, the music that's commissioned, where we put the camera and the visuals that I create are all about framing. And I really think about, who do you give voice? I'm the, you know, my least favorite kind of documentaries are the ones where you have a cast of experts, usually older, white, middle class, upper class men, telling you about the world that they haven't experienced. And I think in the films that I make, I want to show you and then tell you. I want you to feel something. I want to show you through archive or through witnessing something, and then there's the telling. And if you can get people who witness something in real time to tell you that, then all the better. And these are really basic things, but they're things that, you know, there's a lot of films which are out there which are archive, talking head, step to the right. You know, it's very boring. I mean, why would you want to do that? Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling now, but I get very excited about this sort of thing. I think it's interesting to, whenever you start making a film, to allow the space to do it wrong, to explore imagery, and to allow the film to suggest the best way to tell it, and for you to get your hands in there. Every single film I make, I'm obsessive to the point, like, I hand make all of my opening credits. The opening credits of Orion were made with gobos and fireworks, which I cut out by hand.
Awesome. I love that. To kind of like end that point, I wonder if anyone would venture some advice if I'm an emerging filmmaker from Teesside or from the Northeast, and I know I want to get out there and tell some stories. How might I start? And that could be about finding the stories, but it could be about collaborators as well.
I start. So I work amongst different kinds of funds, international and UK. So one of the funds I'm reading on right now is the Made of Truth, the BFI Doc Society Made of Truth Fund. So that's a shorts fund. And it's a part of it is not just funding, it's also mentoring. And so it's targeted more at emerging and talent and new filmmakers. So I see a question here that says, do you have any advice for photographers who might want to move into moving image? Funds like that are really helpful because the mentoring element is very, very strong. So we do things like we'll get, we've gotten a lot of applications that are from new filmmakers or people who are in other disciplinaries and they're moving into documentary filmmaking. And sometimes they don't have any crew, and we always encourage people to apply regardless, and then we will help you with, say, for instance, sourcing a producer or whatever. But we encourage as much as we can is to network as much as you can and to really embrace the collaborative spirit. So there's a lot of filmmakers who feel like they're on an island, especially when it comes to documentary filmmaking, and they have to do everything themselves. And what we encourage them is to understand that some filmmakers can, but very few do. If you want to be able to concentrate on the storytelling of your film, then find someone who can do the producing. These are all roles in which people are trained and experienced in, and there's no shame in not being able to do everything. It's the whole point of the process of filmmaking is to learn how to be collaborative, and that's collaborative with your key film team, with your producer, with your DOP if you're not shooting it yourself, or with your editor. But it's also about being collaborative with the funders that support you, or the programs that support you, your contributors. And someone in the previous question about whether or not COVID, the pandemic, has make it harder to observe those more intimate moments, I think it's actually done quite the opposite. So a lot of people who have not been able to go to locations and things like that have equipped, as Jeanie mentioned, equipped their contributors with cameras, and are teaching the contributors to film themselves. I think that's one of the most visceral ways in which to get the emotional connection the contributor has to the story that's being told. But beyond that, the wonderful nature of documentary for people who are looking into getting into it is that you can pick up a story, just like pick up your camera and shoot some things. So I think that people often assume that if you go through like traditional methods of looking for funding or whatever, that you have to have extensive experience, and you have to, as Jeanie said, it's all about experimenting. It's all about trial and error of what is working for you, what's not working for you. There's no harming like kind of making mistakes. Just pick up your camera, and like it could be that you found an interesting story and the contributor's really interesting. Film a low-key interview with them to give a sense of character to people, because it's amazing what other people will pick up. They might see something else that you are not seeing, and a film can blossom from there. It's all about just being proactive as much as you can, and not thinking that you have to have loads of funding in place, or you have to have all your crew set up and all the things. A lot of the time it's just being proactive and being like, I've got a story, let me pick up my camera and see what I can capture. And then the rest of it kind of falls into place. And yeah, so that's what I would recommend, is just being proactive if you are starting off in docs, and using visual references. So when you're trying to tell your film to other people, talk about films that inspire you and what you like, either creatively or narratively. Those are really important in kind of translating what you have in your head to other people.
I think that's one of the absolutely key things to be able to develop as a filmmaker is how to communicate about the story you want to tell, and make that bridge from subject to it's a film. So for every film that I want to make, it's worth saying that it's really often impossible to get any funding until you've got a sample of something, whether that's, I don't know, a tone document, or a treatment, or more often than not, a 3 to 10 minute pilot. I've just made a 17-minute pilot for the film I was making in America. But I think it's so valuable to do it, because you know whether your film is going to work out, and you get to know the people that you want to, who might be in your film, and also you get to see what they're like on camera. Like really often I've had the experience of you do research on the phone and you speak to someone and they're amazing on the phone, and you put a camera in front of them and it's awful, and they are not they are not going to be good in a film. Like you have to see what it's going to be like. And sometimes when I'm doing that, I do that on my own. But I've also, over the last 8 features, I've gathered a team together of people that understand and know the kind of films that I want to make and share the same sort of spirit of adventure for it. So I've got an amazing music supervisor, Graham. So I can phone him up and ask him to help me clear stuff. And we've sort of developed this relationship over the films. So it's worth saying that you know, in 2 experiences, it's worth not waiting for the funding if you can afford to do that. If you can beg, borrow, steal, well, don't steal, but, you know, get a camera from somewhere. When I started making The Great Hip Hop Hoax, there was 8 other filmmakers and production companies vying for the access because the story had been in The Guardian. The reason why I got the access initially was because I went down 2 days later with my camera with no funding. Everyone else was waiting for the money. It's like, why wait? I can put my time in. I can see whether there's actually a story here, and I can get to know the person while I'm making it. And with Sound It Out, I started making that film because I was so fed up of doing it the right way. You know, we were blocked on access on, we were problems with The Great Hip Hop Hoax. No one would, I couldn't get arrested to make Orion. No one would fund it. And so I joked to Tom at Sound It Out Records that I was going to make a film about his shot one day, and then I just showed up with a camera. I was like, come on, let's just have a go. You know, and I didn't know how to use the camera properly. It was all a bit shonky, all a bit DIY, but the shop is shonky and DIY, and I sort of felt like this, it was like a meeting of the spirits. And I just started shooting, and it was once I'd shot 50 hours on my own. My mum was doing the childcare. I was sleeping in the bedroom I had as a kid. I thought, I've got a film here and I could prove it. It wasn't just me saying I've got a good film. It was like, and I can show you a 10-minute pilot. And these people are amazing. And this is what it's going to look like. I'm going to film the dinosaur park and the landscapes of Teesside and the constant planes going overhead. You know, and I was able to sort of make a creative leap in the project and put it into practice. I think it's really worthwhile. And because sometimes projects just take a while. Once I'd made Sound It Out, and it was this huge sort of, went to South by Southwest, became the, you know, I made it for $9,000, and it traveled the world, was released in 5 countries, and is still, I sold 3 DVDs of it today. You know, once I'd done that, like my guy from The Great Hip Hop Hoax that we were delayed on, he came to a special screening and just said, oh, do you still want to make that film? Let's go ahead. And we've been delayed for 4 years. And sometimes just being active can carry your films on. Once I'd made The Great Hip Hop Hoax, Storyville wanted to know what I was going to do next, and I told them about Orion. And at that point, I'd shot 80 hours and gathered 5,000 images, and I'd got it to a point where they couldn't say no. And that's the point I'm always looking for. You can't turn this project down. You have to say yes. So I absolutely do the most I can without funding, so that when I come to try and get the funding, it's an easy yes.
And that was spectacular advice. And something else I wanted to pull out, Jeanie, from your think piece. Like, I think, you know, that's actually one of the things that I love about docs, is that if you do have access to a camera, and it could be your phone, like, you can start and you can make a film. But I thought one thing that was key, that jumped out from your think piece, was about getting the sound right. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to mention that again. Like,
oh yeah, sell a lens, buy a microphone.
Yeah.
So many. I mean, I now sit on a lot of juries, or I go and do masterclasses with universities and watch films, and if a film looks terrible but sounds good, it can pull you in. But the worst thing is in the world is someone who's got a DSLR, a lovely lens, and it sounds appalling. You know, it's heartbreaking. I went up to a university recently, and this guy had spent 3 years filming this doc in another country, spending thousands of his own money, and he put the clip on for the class to see, and we're like, can't hear it at all. What's going on with the sound? And he was scared to put a microphone on people, and it just sounded, it's just like, oh mate, babes, someone should have told you this 3 years ago. You've got to get good sound. You've got to work with a sound recordist. Or I generally don't work with a sound recordist anymore, because I want it to be intimate and small. But I put every penny I make in a film back into my kit, and buy the best microphones possible, and put 1 or 2 mics on people so you can hear. what they're saying. You can't have an emotional engagement with anyone's story if you can't hear what they're saying.
Fantastic. I just want to pop over to you, Alison, and to just answer this question. Somebody has asked, Lynn mentioned, what advice do you have for photographers who might want to move into moving image or to documentary? And because you kind of sit across all those spaces, I wonder if you could just talk a bit about your work and your experiences.
Yeah, so I think I would say, first and foremost, it would be to kind of shoot as much as you can, shoot photographs, and then I kind of sort of have found it through shooting, I guess, where I think, oh, I kind of want to spend a bit longer here. I think this needs more development. I kind of don't want to just leave just yet. And I kind of find mine really organically in that way. So I don't know if that kind of helps, but again, like Lynn said, watching films and kind of working out what inspires you and why, and kind of keeping abreast of kind of initiatives and commissions as well, and applying for them as well. There's a couple of places, in terms of where I go quite a lot, and I've never sort of thought, there's a film here, but there is, and kind of not sort of, if you keep going back somewhere, I tend to think, right, okay, sort of try and sort of tease it out, try and kind of work it that way, but kind of applying for kind of residencies as well, and mentorship too, I would say.
Maybe we'll do maybe Tees Valley Screen can do a transition from photography to moving image. We've got probably 10 minutes or less, so if anyone has something, and it doesn't have to be a question but a burning contribution, now is your chance. Otherwise, I think this is a nice, I always like framing the discussion, and I feel like we're coming over to the distribution side of things. So we have a question which is about, particularly around COVID, about somebody who has a film that's ready to get out there, that might have been shown to local cinemas or to other groups, and they're not really ready to put it online. And kind of, do you guys have any advice for people about getting other ways of showing your work? But generally, thinking about the long life of a documentary and reaching audiences. I feel like there's this chat to be had.
I would ask that the filmmaker asks, who is his audience and where is the best place for them to view it? Because it might actually be online. So there's often, when I'm working with filmmakers, that's something like, especially new filmmakers, that's something I ask them, because sometimes there's a conflict where they view that their film should be seen in a more traditional light, like, cinema screen, on the big screen. But sometimes that's not actually the easiest or the best way to reach your audience that you have in mind. So it's basically a little bit of kind of stepping back with your ego, because we know that you're obviously your film is your baby. You spent a lot of time on it, but at the same time, it's like fundamentally you're making a film because you want to connect with audiences. And so what is the best way in which to do so? I think in light of COVID, it's just kind of, I feel in general with what we have with the cinemas, they are reopening, but obviously it's limited. And so a lot of the films that are going to be there are going to be the bigger budget. Even before COVID, documentaries struggled to get into cinemas. That was a big issue that the European Documentary Network even did a whole big white paper about documentary filmmaking in Europe, and the lack of, so more films being made, it's more demand, but the spaces in cinemas was less because of the domination of studio films like Disney and places like that. So that's something to consider, that even with lockdown, with the limited opening of cinemas, it's going to be a struggle for programmers of the cinemas or audience development people of cinemas to be able to book your film in a cinema. So it involves being, I always say that the journey of filmmaking doesn't end once you've just made the film. You have to be creative in how you distribute the film. You were creative in how you've got the film made. You have to be creative in how it gets to be seen. So it's all about how can you get the most eyes on the film and what is actually best for reaching that particular audience that you're trying to draw near to. So this doesn't mean you have to just everyone go to Netflix or everyone go to Amazon. You don't need to do that. There are just other ways in which you can go, other platforms that you can go, such as Vimeo, such as like the iStores, things like that, iTunes and things like that. But it's up to you. Or maybe you have a website and you create a website for the film and you release it through there. But it's I would recommend also looking at case studies. So Doc Society has something called the Impact Film Guide, and it's oriented towards impact films, but it gives you an idea of like the distribution case studies that you can just read about. It's completely free. You just go there and download, and you can read about films. There's a whole database of films, and you can pick ones that you relate to your film and see how they got their film out there. But COVID has put kind of a barrier, an extra obstacle in terms of documentary distribution, which means that it might not be ideal. I mean, I'm working for LFF and I'm primarily looking at new filmmakers, and it is a little bit heartbreaking to see that their films, their debuts, their films that are getting so much critical love and stuff, is they're going to miss that whole kind of audience reaction to their films, that kind of visceral experience of watching an audience react to your film. They're going to miss that, but it's all about being adaptable, and that's the nature of documentary filmmaking, is being adaptable to the situation.
I think you're spot on in terms of thinking about what the audience, like, what do you want? Do you want to make money? Do you want to engage a particular audience? Do you want to change the world? Do you want this to be a calling card? Do you want it to be you getting your next film made? Or do you want the setting in which people experience your film to play into the viewing of the film? And I think it's really worth thinking about all of those things. I've got there's two case studies on my website. One for Sound It Out, which we did for the BFI as our distribution using crowdfunding was seen as example of good practice. And then we did a whole case study, and there's an academic study on the work that we did with Orion with wraparound artwork, you know, making an artwork as part of the distribution and the whole journey of the film. But I work very closely with Sally Hodgson, who's a producer in marketing and distribution. Now, working with me on Sound It Out was the first time she ever took on that role. And it meant that while we were making the film, we could think about where it was going to go and bring in the audience with us. So we really developed a strong and devoted audience in the making of the film. And then when we took it out there, we showed in record stores. Now that is something you could do now in a socially distant way. And I showed in record stores all over the world, sitting in the dusty vinyl. With Orion, we did in-person screenings. The retrospective I just had at MoMI in New York, they're running drive-in cinemas. I think if I had a project that needed to go out now, I would be looking at how I could personalize the experience, even if what happens is that it goes out online. If that was what I wanted, I would be looking for how to personalize it. So on Record Store Day this year, we gave Sound It Out away for free because it's almost 10 years. I wanted to just engage with the audience, give the film away. And I got Josie Long to host a live reunion. So we had Saint Saviour there singing, performing live, and we had all of the different contributors came in. So we showed it live, and then it's now become like an extra piece of content. someone's asked the question, do I still see the people in Sound It Out? Yes. Tom, the guy who runs the store, is still a pusher. He's just sent me St. Saviour's album, and I ended up with this great relationship with her. She appears in the film, and she's performed on 3 of my the soundtracks of 3 of my films. But yeah, going back to distribution, I'd just be like, how do you make it? We always used to say, how do you make it a party? How do you bring the audience on board and make it fun? So we had like vinyl parties where the audience brought a record each along, and then they would DJ. So people took it in turns to DJ, and but it's not transferable. But the spirit of what is my film and what am I trying to say and what sort of atmosphere, that should permeate everything from the flyer, the stickers that we put on people because we wanted to engage with them, to the distribution.
Because I was going to ask Alison, like, because she's talking about working within space and like the kind of DIY screenings. Like when I used to work for do a cinema program, it was like pop-up screenings like Beyond Drive-ins, but libraries and open spaces, like just random open spaces of like a blank wall of the side of a pub, and you can put up like little deck chairs or something, socially distanced deck chairs, and people will just sit and watch a film as they're maybe doing their Saturday shop or something like that. Like it depends on, as Jeanie said, whether or not you're making your film because you want to make box office, or whether or not you want to just reach as many people as possible. Those are things you consider, but I was really taken by Alison is like the observance of space. And I think especially now with the pandemic, people are much more observing of their actual space in which they inhabit, and much more looking at the architecture and the landscapes and the green spaces much more clearly. And so it's like, you know, be creative with the use of those spaces that are local to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think Middlesbrough in particular, there's been kind of initiatives like a couple of years back, kind of pop-up cinemas and things like that, and kind of seen some fantastic films in some really lovely places in and around the Tees Valley. So it would be really kind of interesting to think about that again. And yeah, I know what you mean. I think with I suppose with the work that I make, it's kind of like it's very, I mean, there's never any people in my films. It's kind of like very much kind of like meditations on the space, and quite long and almost like a little bit, yeah, like meditative. So it'd be interesting to see how that was shown in kind of like an open space, or in the space that it was made. Would be interesting.
Especially if we can't go to cinemas, like, all right, well, we'll just go where people are instead. We'll go to the shopping centres, we'll go to the train stations. Yeah.
I think it's worth making partnerships as well if you are going to do stuff that's in a sort of non-traditional space, but get all of the partners that already have an audience. So I'm based at Broadway Cinema, but then they haven't been open. But I've been getting them to tell everyone about, you know, if we've done any initiatives. But yeah, I'd be looking to, I went to a really memorable screening in a cave called the Devil's Arse in Derbyshire, of like a climbing film. But it would be amazing. There's so many places on the moors, and you know, I think there's real opportunity to be creative about the way that we do things.
Safe as well.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. But I just wanted to say, like, thank you very much. Love the chat, great chat. Like, invited you all here because I just love how your minds work individually, but it's also cool for me to see like people sparking. I like that. And like great questions from the audience as well. So, you know, hopefully it's been helpful to people that are watching. But yes, just thank you very much for joining us.